Lee Kuan Yew was never impressed by size, he distrusted it instinctively. In his experience, large countries were often the most vulnerable, not because they lacked resources or capability, but because scale created the illusion of permanence. Size made failure feel improbable. It encouraged the belief that momentum would continue on its own. And when that belief took hold, vigilance weakened. He observed that when resources are abundant, geography is forgiving, and institutions appear stable, urgency fades almost automatically. Political systems relax. Societies grow tolerant of inefficiency. Leaders postpone hard decisions because consequences seem distant. In such environments, decline does not arrive as a shock. It arrives as a habit. It begins quietly, not suddenly, not catastrophically, but slowly, politely, and with complete confidence that it will never happen. If Lee Kuan Yew were asked to explain Australia's future, he would not speak in the language of crisis. He would not predict collapse, social breakdown, or geopolitical humiliation. He would speak instead of inevitability. Not inevitability as destiny, but inevitability as the logical outcome of incentives, culture, and structural choices that compound over decades. His shock would not lie in the conclusion, but in how calmly he would explain it. Australia, in his analysis, would be a country that believes it is insulated from history, insulated by distance from global conflict, insulated by wealth accumulated through natural resources, insulated by strong alliances that promise security without demanding constant renewal, insulated by political institutions that have never truly failed. Each layer of insulation feels rational on its own. Together, they numb the instinct to adapt. Lee believed that nations rarely decline because of one fatal mistake. That kind of story is comforting because it suggests decline is rare and dramatic. In reality, he argued, nations decline because they make many reasonable decisions in succession. Decisions that preserve consensus, decisions that protect incumbents, decisions that avoid disruption. Each decision is defensible. Collectively, they harden into rigidity. Australia's trajectory, viewed through this lens, would not be defined by incompetence or corruption. It would be defined by comfort, a system optimized to avoid pain rather than pursue excellence. Over time, comfort becomes structure, and structure resists change, even when circumstances demand it. Australia's prosperity has long been anchored in extraction, minerals, energy, land. These are powerful foundations, and Lee would acknowledge their value, but he would also warn that they are traps. Resource wealth buys time, but it also delays diversification. When money flows easily, productivity becomes optional rather than essential. Efficiency is tolerated instead of demanded. Innovation is praised rhetorically, but not enforced structurally. Lee often said that countries must earn their place in the future continuously. No past success carries forward automatically. The world does not reward historical achievement, it rewards current usefulness. In his view, Australia's success has increasingly become retrospective, celebrated as proof of capability rather than interrogated as a baseline to exceed. He would observe that Australia's political economy rewards distribution over transformation. Resource revenue funds social stability. Social stability reinforces political caution. Political caution discourages disruption. Disruption, however, is exactly what competitive adaptation requires. Systems that do not disrupt themselves eventually get disrupted by others. In Singapore, Lee engineered disruption deliberately and relentlessly. He believed leaders must reform their systems before external pressure forces them to do so under worse conditions. Reform imposed internally could be controlled. Reform imposed externally would be humiliating and costly. Australia, by contrast, tends to wait for pressure. And when pressure arrives, it negotiates rather than restructures. Lee would point to productivity as the quiet indicator of decline. Australia's productivity growth has slowed over time, masked by high commodity prices and steady population growth. Population growth increases total GDP, but it does not increase per capita competitiveness. Lee was obsessed with per capita metrics precisely because they reveal whether a society is becoming more capable, not merely larger. From that perspective, Australia's trajectory would trouble him. Living standards remain high, but relative efficiency declines. Output grows, but capability stagnates. The gap is subtle, but it widens every year. He would argue that Australia's education system produces many graduates, but not enough dense clusters of world-class skill. Universities are numerous, but their global competitiveness is uneven. Research output exists, but commercialization lags. Talent is trained, but not systematically absorbed into ecosystems that can compete at the highest level. Lee believed talent density mattered far more than talent volume. A small number of intensely connected institutions, he argued, outperform large numbers of loosely linked ones. One Singaporean technology park mattered more than dozens of isolated campuses. Australia's size works against density. Distance fragments ecosystems. Fragmentation reduces spillovers. Reduced spillovers slow innovation. Another structural issue Lee would highlight is Australia's political culture. It is consensus-driven, adversarial, and deeply responsive to short-term voter sentiment. Lee admired democracy's legitimacy, but he distrusted its time horizon. Democracies, he argued, excel at managing the present and struggle to prepare for the future. Australia's electoral incentives reward stability, not experimentation. Leaders who propose radical reform face immediate backlash. Leaders who preserve the status quo are rewarded. Over time, governance shifts from preventing decline to managing it. Decline becomes normalized as long as it is gradual. Lee would also be unsparing about labor and regulation. He believed labor markets must be flexible enough to absorb technological and structural change. Australia's labor protections provide security, but they also reduce adaptability. Firms hesitate to restructure. Industries linger beyond relevance. Capital becomes cautious rather than bold. This, Lee would emphasize, is not moral failure. It is systemic logic. Systems produce outcomes consistent with their incentives. Australia's incentives favor continuity over competitiveness, stability over renewal. He would also challenge Australia's reliance on alliances as a substitute for strategy. The assumption that security guarantees and partnerships can compensate for economic and technological underperformance troubled him deeply. Alliances, he warned, are strongest when partners are valuable. Value is not moral, it is functional. It comes from capability, not sentiment. Australia's strategic posture, in his view, risks outsourcing long-term thinking. Security is assumed, markets are assumed, stability is assumed. Assumptions delay preparation, and delayed preparation always costs more. Lee would also note Australia's demographic and geographic paradox, a vast country with a relatively small population concentrated in a handful of coastal cities. Infrastructure costs are high, internal integration is expensive, regional development lags, scale without density is inefficient. Singapore turned density into advantage, Australia's scale dilutes it. He would not argue that Australia is doomed. Lee rarely spoke in absolutes, but he would argue that decline is inevitable unless trajectory changes. Inevitability in his vocabulary did not mean fate. It meant momentum. Momentum continues until it is countered deliberately. The most dangerous aspect, he would say, is that Australians still feel successful. Living standards remain high, institutions function, international respect persists. That feeling delays urgency. By the time urgency becomes undeniable, options narrow dramatically. Lee often warned that when voters finally demand reform, it is already too late to implement it cheaply. Early reform is painful but manageable. Late reform is disruptive, socially divisive, and politically explosive. He would likely compare Australia unfavorably not to failing states, but to relentlessly adaptive ones, countries that continuously upgrade skills, infrastructure, governance, and strategic clarity. Against those benchmarks, Australia appears slow. The decline he would describe would not be dramatic, it would be relative. Others would move faster. Capital would seek higher returns elsewhere. Talent would drift, influence would shrink. Australia would remain rich, but less relevant. Less relevance translates into less leverage. Less leverage narrows choices. Over time, sovereignty becomes constrained not by force, but by dependency. Lee's analysis would unsettle Australians precisely because it would sound reasonable. He would not attack values. He would not deny achievements. He would simply ask whether the system rewards excellence or comfort, and his answer would be uncomfortable. He would conclude that Australia's decline is not the result of enemies, conspiracies, or global injustice. It is the result of incentives that no longer align with survival in a hyper-competitive world. If nothing changes, decline will not feel dramatic. It will feel like stability. It will feel like normalcy. It will feel like success until it no longer does. That, Lee Kuan Yew would say, is how advanced nations fall behind, not with noise, but with confidence.